Thank you, Mikhail. It's very scary to see myself here aging as he's talking in that photo. And realizing that, in fact, what I'm going to be talking about is the next 30 years. And if I last that long, I'll probably look like that last slide that was up there, which is unfortunate. But he's correct in setting this conversation up. I did actually write a story in the mid-90s that was looking ahead 25 years actually to the year 2020. And here we are at 2020. And then as this was building, I've approached Wired Magazine again, and they've kind of talked with me to say, wow, what if we looked ahead another, in this case 30 years, to 2050? Could we actually do that? And in fact, that's what's going to happen early next year. The cover story at Wired is going to be this story. I'm right now in the phases of writing, and after having just reported it. And in fact, in my reporting, so many people were so positive about the future, counter to a lot of the feelings out there, that they started to say it's not just going to be another long boom of technology and economics, but it'll be a long boom squared. And so the working title now is The Long Boom Squared. Now, what I'll be doing, though, is trying to fill out, we'll touch on generations and their impact on this, but it's trying to fill out a positive but plausible way forward. How could we get beyond all the difficulties we're in now, the challenges of climate change and massive inequality? How could we actually get there to not really a utopia in a full sense of the word, but a much better world in the next 30 years? And I'm hoping to make that case to you today. And so I think the best way to understand it and put you in the space of it is this is the cover of that story that came out. I wrote it in 1996. It came out in July of 1997. And the reason we did the story at the time was there was a malaise in America and kind of through the West. There was a sense among the boomer generation that they weren't going to be as well off as their parents, the kind of GI generation and the post-war boom. There was a kind of a sense that America was in decline, and it was a kind of an era of like how people could not see the future. And at Wired, we were looking at these very new technologies of the digital revolution and thinking, what are people thinking? They're missing this crazy story that's emerging in front of us. And so we said, let's write the optimistic, positive way forward of what could happen if these technologies came together. And here we are. And so we wrote the story from 1980 to 2020. So here we are at 2020, and we'll see how we went. Now, at the time in the mid-90s, this is in the year 2000, a little even after the mid-90s, that's how many people in the world were on the internet. About 31% of North America, but look at the other regions of the world, very few. 10 years later, that's how many people were on the internet as a percentage of each of these regions. And even just last year, we've gone that far. Now, there's still some to go, but essentially we said, hey, everyone's going to be connected in this era through the internet. And this is going to actually spur all kinds of positive things. And in fact, that played out. When we wrote this story, there were about 250,000 websites only. Very little. We said, you know what? There's going to be these websites all over the place. And now it's close to 2 billion websites. We've seen how that's kind of exploded. When the month that my story came out, Apple Computer begged Steve Jobs to come back and be their CEO because the company was about to go bankrupt. And as we know, over the course of this, and we said, no, these companies are going to be extremely powerful and extremely valuable. And in fact, Apple became the first trillion-dollar company, as we know, and not just them alone. When we wrote this, again, around the year 2001, these were the most valuable companies in the world, which was a 20th century economy with manufacturing, oil, financial services, retail, one technology company who had come out of the dot-com boom. And we said, no, over the time, technology will be the most powerful companies in the world. And in fact, here, the most recent numbers are right there. Since 2016, the commanding heights of the global economy have been dominated by technology firms. We said, We also, this is Shanghai, as many of you know here. I was a foreign correspondent 30 years ago in the kind of Tiananmen Square era, and this did not exist 30 years ago. It's only coming that. But we said in this article, you know, China's going to basically come from a kind of a middling kind of country here in the mid-90s. This is their GDP compared to the United States. They will be another superpower at the end of this era of globalization. And in fact, that played out. In fact, If you look at the top 10 most valuable companies in the world, 2 of them now are technology companies from China, Tencent and Alibaba. And so this is the real commanding heights of the top 10 now have Chinese companies in there. And many people at the time said, oh, the boom, a long boom. You're talking about a stock boom. And then when the dot-com boom happened, they said, oh, what happened to this boom? But in fact, we weren't talking about a stock boom. We were talking about an economic boom. But even that case, if you take the Dow Jones from the mid-90s here up until today's, it's been a 20 times the Dow Jones has gone up over the course of this technology and economic boom. So what about this news story? What is the next story? As we started to go, we actually, just before we go there, the next story, so today, people are even more in a funk about the future. They even have more dystopian feelings about what's ahead. They're scared of the future. They're freaking out. We're watching political backlash and everything else. And so we said, hey, of all times, this is the time to go forward into the future, talk about the positives of what's possible out there, and get people a way that they can see forward. And so we did this. Now, part of my reporting has been based on what I do here with Capgemini. I partner with Capgemini, and I host in San Francisco a series called What's Now San Francisco, where we take leading innovators from all these different kind of fields and have them come in and talk about what's happening right now in their field and how it's going to affect the future. And we actually have expanded it to New York, and Capgemini has now spread that around their innovation labs all over the world right now. But through this, I've been able to understand what is really building for the future. And for my reporting for this story, I talked to 25 leading experts all over the world, different fields, and all their expertise. And unbelievably, most of the people had a very positive hit on what's really possible out there. Not dystopian, not negative, but a positive way forward. And one of the reasons is I think too many people in general, although maybe not this group, are looking very close. They get caught in the forest, not being able to see beyond the tree. They look at the latest tweet from President Trump or the stock market price, and they kind of go, oh, that's fascinating. And then some people step back a little bit and say, okay, there's more tweets than Trump, and let's think about what's going on here. But what I'm going to do is try to get you out of that view. Look big picture. Really think about what's really happening here. And one way to do that is to think with a historical perspective. So if you basically today look back on World War II, let's say, the era that came, the great boom that came off of the post-war boom, we understand that story now. We can see, coming off the Great War, there was an American boom in the 50s, and by the 60s, Europe was back on its feet and Japan was booming, and that economic boom only kind of came to an end with the oil shocks, the lifeblood of that economy. We can kind of understand that from an economic point of view. We understand the technologies that came out of the war, plastics and mainframe computers and atomic energy. We understand how that played out in the era, and we also understand the politics, how the welfare state was built, how America kind of had a kind of a New Deal coalition. We understand that whole perspective. And so when we actually talk about today, where are we here today? Oh, here we are. I'm standing here today. With that distance, we get that story. We see it so clear. There's no debate about it. It's like, oh yeah, we get how that works. So what we do with the kind of history is to think, okay, well, what was the era we just came through? It's not as clear. But we say, the 80s, yeah, we had those personal computers came in. Everybody got a computer. In the 90s, we had this internet that started to connect them all up. And then in the 2000s, we were kind of the mobile. Yeah, mobile started, went mobile. And then, by the end of that decade, we had these tech titans running the economy. We can see the technology story. But we can also see a story of economics, globalization, how we tied the world together, partly with these technologies. We can also see a political story. We can kind of see a story that was largely a conservative era, a pro-business era, kind of where capital essentially was dominant over a kind of, let's say, the interests of many workers. And it's both for good and the bad. It's actually created the world we have today. Now, you're technology people, and I just wanted to say, the core of a lot of these changes comes in what are the technologies we have. And I want to just mention this the doubling of Moore's law, the idea of exponential kind of power of these technologies, is to remind people these are all doublings. But these doublings aren't that dramatic. These get more dramatic. As they keep going, it gets extremely dramatic. And so this is why technology graphs are logarithmic graphs. These are all going up orders of magnitude. And just to remind you, when we started this era in 1980, this was how many this is the transistor microprocessors, and we have kept doubling and doubling and doubling to the point where we are now, true to what we thought, at 10 billion kind of microprocessors. It's a crazy kind of logarithmic thing. And we've got also the speed of the actual, how fast the computers have gone through the same logarithmic graph. Again, a theory here absolutely happened. If you even then go to supercomputers, some supercomputers have now gone even so far, they're in the trillions of kind of cycles here. And they are essentially, they've been on the same track. So we've watched this incredible power. We've watched it with storage. This is the storage capacity logarithmically going up. So just to put it in concrete form, it's hard to remember, but 1 gigabyte used to cost $700,000 in 1980. And in fact, today, or even by 2013, it was 4 cents. This dynamic. So this has created the world that we're in today. Now, I want to say one other thing about this is there's also been positive benefits that are beyond the technology. We've watched prosperity spread throughout the world. This is, again, a long graph way back into the Industrial Revolution, but clearly we're lifting the prosperity of people around the world. Poverty has come down dramatically. Everyone used to be poor here in the old days. By 1980, we were driving, about half the world was still dirt poor, $2 a day. Boom, we've driven that down, largely with China helping there. We've essentially watched, used to be constant battles. This is the battle deaths in World War II, and this is the kind of Korean War period in Vietnam. Basically now the world is so stitched together, very few deaths in wars. This is, all technology is getting better and safer and better. This is airline flights. It's gotten so far, it's super safe now in ways that it didn't used to be. Things like education around the world. The West, even way back here in the late 19th century, we're at high levels, but the whole world is catching up to basic education and literacy. We've watched, in fact, human rights go up in positive ways. How many countries have now abolished the death penalty, unlike in America? And we've even seen the rise of, since the Cold War ended, of democracies over authoritarian living. Many ways our world has gotten better. And that's what I just want to return to, is we're also moving into it going forward in this long boom too. Now, if you take this next era, we actually are going to have a whole different kind of set. We're at the front of it, it's hard to see. But this is an era where we're going to watch a crazy transformation around artificial intelligence. We're going to watch a total transformation in energy. We're going to watch a complete transformation in genetics, biotech, and biology, the biological sciences. And ultimately, by the end of it, who knows, something more like space. But I want to kind of say that this era, I think, will be very different than this era. I think it is going to be, like Carlotta was talking about yesterday, it's going to be an era that it's probably going to be more egalitarian economics, spreading wealth differently through society. It's probably going to actually have more, the populism of today is going to be more progressive, essentially restructuring of society. And we'll organize society differently than this era, just like they had it very differently than today. And that's what I want to get you thinking about a little bit here as we go through this fast. Now, many experts have been talking about AI here. Oops, let me just go back on that. And all I want to do is put this in a little bigger context, not the specifics. But there's much talk of, the robots are going to take over and run the world. That's just not true. In San Francisco, where I'm based, many talks with AI experts. We are not on a path towards general intelligence in robotics or AI anytime soon. I mean, certainly not in the next 30 years. There is going to be disruption with many kind of jobs going through changes, but even there's a confidence that we can get through that. So many ways I would say, think about how does AI augment pretty much everything we do. And I think that's the way to be thinking now about it, not fearing it. And now, one way to understand it, since you're all, or many of you, CIOs, is AI is just pretty much a function of data, how much data we now have. Because of those last 40 years, everything's digital, everything's captured, now we have all this data. And just one little graphic on that. If you go back to the first time we started putting information on stone blocks, till now, we essentially, all human beings have created about 5 exabytes of data up until the early part of the years, the 2000s here. We now produce 5 every 2 days, and that doubling phenom is doubling every year. And so, in fact, by 2015, we were at a couple zettabytes. We're now at about 40 zettabytes of data and just continuing. Now, AI is great, and essentially just no human can engage with that. So essentially, AI arrives just in time to deal with all this data. And we're able to, deep learning is essentially just AI making sense of that data instantaneously in human speeds that just don't even come remotely close. Now, what's happening there is AI will essentially just become as ubiquitous as electricity. There'll be 10,000 startups, as there are now, going into every niche of society. Would be how do we apply AI deep learning into essentially all aspects of business and all aspects of life. But I want to just focus on one thing that people underestimate, is how this is going to accelerate innovation. And here's just one example of that. We are now at the point, our most advanced, Google, just its most advanced computers now, are actually beating language translators, language translators in terms of their accuracy and speed. And so very soon here, regular conversation, we will essentially be able to connect every language in real time between everybody on the planet, because we're all connected. Now think about how that would accelerate innovation. People from all over the world, particularly when AI can find innovators all over the world, connect every document that has something to do with a specific innovation, translate these between Farsi and Chinese and French simultaneously. That is just going to lead to an explosion of innovation. So I think what we have to keep thinking about, there is going to be essentially new ways forward through this explosion of innovation in the coming decades here that is essentially going to redefine almost every era or every industry. And I think what you're going to see is these flipping points where people finally go, there's a new way forward, boom, let's take it. Now I want to just give you a couple examples of that. We don't have enough time to go through the whole thing, but take climate change. Because as we know, this same timeline of going up of technology has been putting our carbon into the atmosphere through the Industrial Revolution here. And in fact, my state right now, San Francisco, you barely can breathe in San Francisco right now because we're fighting fires on all sides, basically due to climate change, changing conditions and worsening conditions. But it's now, even in America, to the point now where people kind of get, we have to do something dramatic, and we will. And I think this is where, when you start looking at the next generation of technologies like solar, we're watching the very similar things to what happened with digital. We're watching what used to take place in the 80s, about 76 bucks an hour, a watt, sorry. It's now about 22 cents. This is crazy. And so because of the drop, 350% decline. This drop in price now has gotten to the point where solar is now beating traditional carbon. In many places like California, it's cheaper, and Africa even now, cheaper to install solar, and that is going to be the norm around the world, even undermining gas. We're also watching solar take up that same doubling phenomena. This is by 2015, but in fact, a logarithmic chart, if you take it to the latest dates here, solar has grown 1,000 times just since the early 90s here. We're back, we're in that same kind of era. So again, I would say watch for a flip that's happening right now around energy. Same thing with electric cars. Fascinating. This is the Teslas. We've watched the price of batteries essentially come down. This is 2010. It's to the right about now. We are now getting competitive to the internal combustion engine. And in fact, if you go out to 2030, this is very reliable prediction here, it's going to come down about another 3 to 5 times to 2030. This is where right about in the next 3 years or so, it's going to essentially become cheaper to manufacture and drive and own electric vehicles than internal combustion. And again, you're watching the market here, particularly in the United States, with Tesla, boom, is starting to take off in all the electric, hybrids and electric, and we're going to see that, again, flipping away. I think you're going to watch that flip extremely fast. It's going to be very disruptive. Now, we don't have the time to do it, but I want to just say, this would take a whole nother talk. But the thing is, humans now can have all their genetic understanding of the genetics and actually can now genetically engineer, not just themselves, but all plants and all animals. That is an astounding opening. And in fact, what's happening here, the first human genome took $2 billion in the big project here we did. And by 2010, it was about $2 million. And now it's about $1,000. Anyone here can get it. In fact, they're thinking it's closer even to about $500. Well, you know, everybody's going to have their genetic code figured out. And so we're going to watch and then you can manipulate it. Now, so we're going to watch huge changes in the life sciences. Not enough time to go into that. But we're also going to see it in materials society and food. You're watching it with artificial meat now. You're starting to watch it with materials, building materials. Plastics could be replaced by biodegradable kind of new kinds of materials. Again, another thing to happen in these next 30 years. It's going to flip a little bit later, but that's going to come within a short time. Now, we're talking about generations, so I want to kind of end with this thing. The shift in demographics. And coming from the United States, I study this more closely in the United States. This is the population right now of the United States by year and by how many people in each cohort. And like Mikhail put up there, using the kind of the generations there. And so if you take the guts of the economy, workers, consumers, the baby boomers are already moving off stage here, and the Gen X and millennials clearly the biggest generation. Gen Z in the United States, not as big as millennials, but very comparable to millennials. So think about, okay, that's now. Well, if you take it out another 10 years, wow, those boomers are going further out. You're watching essentially the domination of these generations. This is what's happening. This is 2030, right? 2040, essentially, it's the Gen Xers. You folks in the room here now are starting to fade out here, and it's essentially just totally dominated by them. We don't know what's actually happening here. And ultimately, though, by 2050, what I'm describing, this world has been defined by them, it's been created by them, and essentially coming out the other end there that's their world. So again, this has been very clear through our conversations today. What does that generation want to do? That is essentially what we're going to do. Those two big generations going forward. The switch is flipping, and it's flipping today. Now, I do want to just say a few words about politics, because we're all, in the United States, convulsed in a political polarization and paralysis. Europe has its version. We're having Brexit in England, and there's rise of populism here. One of the reasons is anytime you have these huge shifts, you're inevitably going to have to try to work it out in politics. And in fact, so there's a lot of the angst and depression essentially of now has to do with our politics. And I, though, do believe, partly because of these demographic shifts, partly because of these technology shifts, that we're entering a new kind of phase, you could say. In this case, I'm looking at it from an American perspective. I think we're going to watching very quickly here, including in this next election, we're going to start to watch a different kind of politics break out here. I'm not exactly sure how it plays out in Europe, but we're on the verge of essentially a different era of politics based in a different generational kind of composition and coalition looking towards a different kind of future. In this case, I was just putting it out here. One thing I'd say, again, I'm a little bit of a chauvinist here on this, and I actually they write about it in this book here, my interview here. I really think what's happening in California is the best insight right now into what will ultimately be a politics that goes through the United States much more fully, and ultimately some kind of version of it in Europe as well. That there is a different politics, a fantastic change. California had invented essentially modern conservative politics with Ronald Reagan and the tax revolt and all that back in the beginning of that last era, the 80s. And essentially, we're watching what this is the governor, Gavin Newsom. Keep an eye on him. I've interviewed him many times in my series there, including the Capgemini one. He knows tech. He totally gets what's going on. He's completely committed to understanding what's going on with the climate change, open to the diversity of society, open to the globalization and the ultimate globalization. And so basically, we're watching a different politics there. Even if your politics are different, you'd be wise to study what's happening there. And so I will just kind of end here by saying there is a different politics that is essentially going to create up a whole different set of 21st century solutions. It'll be artificial intelligence through everything, private sector, public sector. We'll watch you're going to watch a whole level of robotics take care of so much of the boring work, essentially, the world out there, as well as humans being pushed more into creative kind of functions and ones that require empathy. We're going to watch clean energy transformation, totally going off carbon, completely onto clean energies. We're going to watch electric transportation. It's going to take 30 years. A sharing economy, some people have talked about that. Rebuilt cities from the ground up, I think, packing more people into bigger cities. Genetic understanding, reworking our world of materials, essentially our world of food, new kinds of ways, meat, and ultimately a whole way of sustainability. And with that, I would just say, get excited, be confident. We're moving into a very, very positive era. A long boom, not just a long boom, but a long boom squared. Thank you.
You did it.
I did it.
You discussed 200 years. 100 years of the history, 100 years into the future in 30 minutes. So that is very good.
Exactly.
So one of the greatest philosophers of our time says that the fires in California have nothing to do with climate change, but there are just too many trees.
Who is that philosopher?
It's your president.
Yes, exactly. This is one of the problems.
So what could go wrong? What could go wrong in your scenario? You're so optimistic. What are the spoilers? I know scenario planning. I did a course with GBN a long time ago. Mm-hmm. There are also always spoilers. What are the spoilers?
Well, I would say this. As he mentioned, I worked in a scenario planning outfit for many years and with some of the best scenario planners in the world. It's almost always the scenario spoilers are essentially based in people. It's politics, it's essentially decisions, bad decisions people make, mass kind of movement, and that kind of screws things up. It's very rarely the technology itself that gets essentially out of control. It's not essentially, and it's often, I would say, but it's think of it as choices we have to make. Now, I would argue what's happening with Trump, Brexit, populism in Europe here, is essentially people can't see that next future, and the next generation of leaders hasn't really articulated that future. And I think it's this kind of anxiety and this fear of the future that's building into that. Easiest way to go is to say, let's go backwards, let's go back to what it was, let's go make America great again, because it's harder to say, hey, there's this new thing out here. But I think that is what I think is shifting very quickly here in the next several years, and I think it's a big change. It's a very dramatic change, but I think it's going to actually break out very clearly and very fast. And the thing about a very interconnected planet is when things start moving, the tipping points, they go extremely fast. And I think that's going to happen in politics more than we think. I think we're caught right now on the edge of the flipping point, and I think that's going to happen. And all we need, think of it this way, all you need is to reconfigure 60% of society into a consensus around a new way forward, and that is essentially a dominant political coalition that can move forward. And every one of those other junctures in the past formed that coalition at those junctures and essentially moved forward. And then it didn't matter what the kind of aging boomers kind of supporting Trump care, because they're 30% and dying off. You know, it's essentially another way forward. And I think we're at that tipping point right now.
So I asked a question to the audience earlier through the Busmaster system about this, who is going to lead us into the future? And 70%, more than 70% said it's the new generation that's going to lead us. Do you agree with that? Are you optimistic about that?
Well, as an older person, I will say this, or relatively older.
Older, just older.
Yes, I think here's what I'm thinking. The guts, the energy, the kind of of a society is driven by this younger generation. I would say, honestly, it's the millennial generation that has now come of age. They're now starting to have families. They're now in their 30s, 20s. They're engaged in society. They're invested in society. They're angry about many things like inequality and climate being kind of not addressed. That is the critical group. The synthetic is behind them, very similar attitudes, so they're not distinct. So together, those two are essentially going to drive it. But here's the point. There's a role for the Gen Xers and for the boomers, too, because actually the visionaries that help articulate that way forward are not always in that generation. They're the generation that, so for example, FDR, the great president that led America out of the Great Depression and World War II, he was not essentially a GI generation. That GI generation was kind of John F. Kennedy, who was a young person coming out of the war and all that, and then later became a president by 1960. But it's the guts of that generation that came back from the war that drove those changes. But the vision had to be articulated for the older generations.
Okay.
And I think there's a role for everyone in this.
So here are a group of technology decision makers. So what would be your advice to them as those decision makers?
Be fearless. I think it's too easy right now because of the politics, because of how everything is so just difficult to talk about, that business has essentially been kind of too cautious. Now you're starting to see changes. In the United States, the business roundtable is now starting to shift. Hey, it's not all about shareholder value. It's about stakeholders. And I know Europe's have been very good at that, but I think this is the time to make really bold decisions. It's inevitable it's shifting to green. It's inevitable it's shifting to clean. It's inevitable it's going to go faster than almost anyone thinks. Make the decisions now, help build that momentum early, and I tell you, it will be profitable and beneficial to you long run, because all those workers, all those consumers, all those people, they're forming their attitudes right now about the kind of companies, the kind of products, the kind of things they're going to invest in for the next 60 years. And this is the time to make that. Right now in the United States, a very interesting question, if I may point this out. There is essentially two factions of auto industry have a battle right now in the United States. Are they going to go with California's much greener, much more ambitious standards for fuel efficiency and pushing onto electric cars as fast as possible? Or are you going to stay with the Trump administration, which is trying to lower these standards, get rid of the kind of Obama standards, and in fact go back to dirty or stay in the kind of internal combustion engine? The companies that are choosing California are going to be, by far, the companies that are going to dominate the next era. And those poor decisions by those legacy companies going with Trump, this generation will not forget that. They will not forget those kind of decisions. And in fact, I'm already hearing it, people saying General Motors and Toyota just went with Trump, and there is a whole crew that's just going to say, you know what, I'm done with these people. And I think it's going to happen in every field. And so I think if you really want to be bold. You might take some flack from those aging boomer and other kind of board members.
Be fearless.
But be fearless. Okay. And keep clear on what the future is. It is one way forward. I shouldn't say there's one way forward, but it's clear the direction forward. And it's also clear the time is now.
All right, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.